So welcome everyone to our third session of Chancellor's Day. If this is the first session that you are joining today, thank you for participating. Our next speaker is Bonnie Gurewitsch. Bonnie Gurewitsch is the former archivist and curator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. She has been a Holocaust educator and oral historian for more than 45 years. She is the author of Mothers, Sisters, Resistors, Oral Histories of Women Who Survived the Holocaust, among other publications. She has curated special exhibitions at the museum and is currently an advisor to the Heritage Testimonies Project at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Bonnie will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which time we will take questions from participants. So if you do have any questions throughout the lecture, you can just put them in the chat and we'll read them afterwards. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Bonnie.
Hello. Today I'm going to speak about hiding and passing during the Holocaust. And I'm calling it uncertain refuge because uncertainty is what characterizes this kind of experience during the Holocaust. So why did Jews go into hiding during the Holocaust? What would cause Jewish parents to place their child in the care of strangers? Were there no alternative avenues of safety? The experience of Anne Frank's family can serve as an example of some of the challenges faced by Jews under Nazi occupation. Anne Frank was born in Germany in 1929. Her father, Otto, was a successful businessman. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, they instituted harsh measures against the Jews. Feeling threatened, Otto Frank decided to leave Germany. First, he set up a branch of his business in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Mr. and Mrs. Frank, slide please. Slide 1.
It is on slide 1, Bonnie. Are you not able to see it on your screen?
No.
We're on slide 1. Thank you.
Okay. And Mr. and Mrs. Frank and Anne's older sister, Margot, left Germany in 1933. Anne joined them in Amsterdam in 1934. In 1938, Otto Frank realized that the best option for the family would be to leave Europe entirely. He applied for emigration to the United States in 1938 through the American consulate in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. In April 1941, he also wrote to his brothers-in-law in the United States and to his friend, Nathan Strauss, one of the owners of Macy's, who he got to know when Otto had done an internship in Macy's. He hoped that his brothers-in-law and Strauss would be able to help the family emigrate. However, American immigration policy imposed strictly limited quotas on the numbers of people allowed to immigrate to the United States. No provision was made for people escaping persecution. The application of the Frank family was one of many tens of thousands of applications of German Jews that had to be processed by the American consulate. On May 14, 1940, Rotterdam was heavily bombed by the German Air Force. The American consulate was destroyed, and so were the files of applicants for American visas. So the Frank family was trapped in Amsterdam with no avenue escape or rescue. When neither rescue nor escape were options, one alternative was to remain in place with the community and share their fate. As Nazi occupation engulfed Europe, Jews had little or no news of the fate of other Jewish communities. The Nazis controlled the news, so there was no reliable source of information, no independent newspapers, no radios, and certainly no internet. There were rumors of mass murders that were hard to believe. Even if rumors of mass murder reached Jewish communities, it is very difficult to accept the reality that you might indeed be the victim of mass murder. However, some Jews realized that the community was doomed, that the chances for survival within the community were less than the chances of survival for an individual or a family unit alone. There was no way of knowing which choice was better. No one knew where it might be safer. The choice to leave the community was often instinctual, not rationally thought out. Harry Stein, 16 years old, was convinced that the best way of surviving was to remain undocumented, to stay under the Nazi radar. Harry explained, "I was 16 at the time. Somehow I had a strong instinctive feeling that if we accept that resettlement order, it would be the end of us. It would be internment. It would be a camp. Although there was no final solution in place at the end of 1940 or beginning of 1941, I had a very strong instinct that we should not follow that order." That choice was counterintuitive. Jews were law-abiding. To disobey orders, not to register, not to show up for the so-called resettlement, was counter to their normal behavior pattern. And the choice to leave the community was fraught with unknown dangers. There were two kinds of hiding during the Holocaust. One was to stay in a physically hidden place. Like the attic that sheltered the family of Anne Frank, a physical space had to be concealed, unlikely to arouse suspicion, for hiding Jews was a crime punishable by death. Tim Cole describes hiding as, quote, "going nowhere, a kind of imprisonment where movement was severely restricted and freedom curtailed," end of quote. One of the first results of Nazi occupation was that Jews were expelled from their homes. They had to find hiding places elsewhere, either in abandoned places or in places that were owned by non-Jews who were willing to shelter them. Jews hid in attics. Here you see attics in an apartment house in the row of small windows all the way up on top. In lofts of barns, in chicken coops, in dugout spaces under houses or barns, in the hollow of a tree, behind false walls, in wardrobes. These spaces were often cramped and small. Jews hiding there were unable to move freely and had to be silent so their presence would not be detected. If someone got sick or injured, medical care was not available or risked betrayal. Jewish males were identified by their circumcision, so a little Jewish boy might die of a childhood illness because it was too risky to call a doctor. In 1941, Luba Gordus and her 4-year-old son, Robert, whom she called Bobus, were hiding in Zwierniec, Poland. Bobus developed diphtheria and died on September 12, 1942. Luba was later sent to Majdanek concentration camp. She survived and emigrated to Palestine in 1946, where she was reunited with her husband. The photograph on the left is of Bobus at a year and a half prior to Nazi occupation. In 1977, Luba Gordus, an accomplished artist, drew a portrait of Bobus from memory. European Jews were usually urban or semi-urban rather than from rural or farming settlements. Each required different skill sets. Jews who left their towns and villages had little experience of living in primitive conditions or outdoors. Some reached partisan groups who lived in the forest, but even there, Jewish identity was a liability. Jews who were fortunate to find a Jewish partisan group were protected because they were Jews. But anti-Semitism was a serious danger in non-Jewish partisan groups, even as Jews and non-Jews fought a common enemy. Jews usually had to hide their identity, and men had to be especially careful not to reveal their circumcision. In many cases, acceptance of strangers depended on how useful the person seeking help could be to his or her protector. Jews who were hiding on farms often performed various tasks that could be done indoors, such as knitting, sewing, or repairing tools. In some cases, Jews were hidden in exchange for payment or promise of payment that might be in the form of valuable objects or even of real estate. In the museum's collection is a contract written by a Jewish woman who promised a list of specific assets, houses in town, complete with their addresses, to the Pole who protected her and her children. Women in hiding had no access to birth control. Malnutrition contributed to amenorrhea. Jewish women who did become pregnant, like Nina Matatias in Greece, gave birth in primitive, makeshift conditions without medical care, sometimes alone, and could not prepare supplies for a baby. Nina and Jack Matatias were hiding in a remote village in the mountains of Greece. Nina told, "It was December 3rd, 1943, about 10 o'clock at night. It was snowing. It was very cold. As I was giving birth to my son, the village people came running. 'The Germans are coming! The Germans are coming!' So we ran a few meters out of the village and we found a little hiding place and we stayed there." Bringing a Jewish child into a hostile world where parents could not assure its survival was an act of faith and of little choice. That the Matatias parents agreed to let their childless protectors adopt their son in case they did not survive was evidence of their helplessness and their hope that the Greek couple would assure their son's survival. Jews in hiding needed a trustworthy individual like Mip Chis, who helped the Frank family. Sometimes more than one was needed to bring them food, water, and other necessities, and to remove their waste. Supplying food at a time when food was strictly rationed in occupied Europe was challenging and dangerous. Jews in hiding were not eligible for ration cards, so the helper had to find an illegal source who would not betray him or her for acquiring extra food. As a result of the difficulties and dangers of procuring food when supplies were so limited, Jews in hiding usually barely subsisted on very limited nourishment. Excuse me. A second type of hiding was to assume a false identity and pass as a non-Jew among Christians. Tim Cole explains, quote, "In order to even seriously consider the possibility of surviving on the so-called Aryan side of the wall, it was widely assumed that certain things needed to be in place: a set of non-Jewish social networks and the money to pay for their services and the necessary looks to pass as non-Jewish." End of quote. Obtaining the documents needed in order to prove a false identity was very difficult and usually expensive. Connections were needed with forgers or with Catholic priests who could supply a false baptismal certificate. One of the illegal activities of Jewish youth organizations was to forge false identity documents, like this false ID for Harry Stein. He became Henry Perrin. In addition to providing documents, the Jewish organizations often stayed in touch with the people they hid, providing food, money, medicine, and other necessities. Another aspect of this assistance is the moral support that this contact provided to Jews in hiding, alleviating the isolation of the hiding experience and offering hope and encouragement. Harry Stein stole a rubber stamp from the mayor's office in the town where he was hiding and used it on false documents that his Zionist group was forging. Here is the false ID that Harry provided for his mother, for whom he also provided a hiding place in an isolated village in the mountains of France. Most false documents had to be purchased. Sophie Billies and her husband, Henrik Bialystok, left their daughter with relatives and lived separately with false identities. Sophie's brother-in-law had converted to Judaism when he married her sister before the war, but he still had his Christian identity papers, which provided cover for him and his family, especially when they moved to another town where they were not known. Sophie and her husband, Henrik, split up, each one pursuing survival as a non-Jew under different circumstances. They left their daughter, a toddler, with Sophie's sister and brother-in-law, visiting her only occasionally. Sophie first tried to rescue members of her family from the Lodz ghetto and did succeed in rescuing an infant niece who she also placed with her sister, but she was not successful with her parents. In addition to having a close relative who had a legitimate Christian identity, both Sophie and Henrik had personality and character traits that helped them create and sustain their Christian identities. They both grew up in mixed Jewish and Christian environments and were comfortable interacting with non-Jews. Both were athletic, in their 20s, and in good physical shape. Both were blonde and blue-eyed and spoke Polish without Jewish intonation. Both possessed great ability to assert themselves and make split-second decisions, even in the face of great danger, and were thus able to evade detection from Christians who saw Jews as stereotypically passive and frightened of authority. Henrik Bialystok describes one dangerous episode. I was at the Vistula River with a group of friends from work, girls and boys, maybe 8 of us. We played volleyball. A guy comes up behind me. Show me your ID. You are Jewish. I knew he was a Jew by his accent. He was wearing a swastika pin. I took out my ID. Then I saw 3 Gestapo guys coming in my direction. Gestapo. They surrounded me and they said, pull down your swim trunks. My friends came over to see what happened. And then my personal guard was there and I pulled down my trunks. The guy said, I can see that you are Jewish, you are circumcised. I said, I am not Jewish and I'm not circumcised. I was talking calmly, like I'm calm now, in spite of it. Then he said, if you are not Jewish, go. He gave me back my ID and left. Sophie and Henrik did not fit either a Jewish physical or cultural stereotype. Both were able to think on their feet and lie convincingly, even when physical evidence contradicted what they were saying. Sophie was able to dig up gold coins that she had buried in the cellar of her house in Lodz, which provided her with food and other necessities and helped her get false documents. With these false documents, both Sophie and Henrik were able to get jobs, which provided them with apartments, income, and access to food. This unique combination of characteristics did not guarantee survival, but certainly contributed to it. Living separately for most of the Holocaust period, they had peace of mind knowing that their daughter was safe and loved by their extended family. They could therefore concentrate on self-preservation. Sophie was able to be helpful to relatives and others in the Warsaw Ghetto until it was sealed. Their daughter Amelia did not even know that she was Jewish, and had the security of living with family and a cousin of similar age with whom she bonded. Even when her Jewish identity was revealed to Amelia after the war, she quickly overcame her shock and distress when her cousin admitted that she too was Jewish. Like the Billies family, Jack and Nina Matatias and a few other members of their family lived as Jews in hiding, but in a remote Greek mountain village, somewhat isolated geographically from the Nazi threat. The Greek villagers who knew that the Matatias were Jewish were also threatened by the Nazis. They were protective of the Jewish couple and did not betray them. Poverty, experienced similarly by Jews and Greek Christians, created shared values and loyalties. Being young and healthy, Nina had an uneventful pregnancy and gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Their protectors in the village, a childless couple, suggested that in return for protection, Nina and Jack should agree to give them the baby. The tenacity with which the parents held on to the child, even involving a decision by the local Greek metropolitan, is an expression of the fraught relationship between them and their Greek protector, where the protector had the physical power and the Jews prevailed with moral power. This unbalanced power is best exemplified in the experiences of the Verdeber family. The pre-war status and resources of the family hardly helped them. Mr. Verdeber was an early victim of the Nazis. Mrs. Verdeber and her sister were able to hide for a year and a half in Gurewitsch, a small Polish town where the barter of the furnishings and other valuables that they removed from their Krakow apartment and took with them sustained them for a while. But it soon became clear that they were no better off on their own in Gurewitsch. Mrs. Verdeber sent some of the children back to Krakow, and eventually she and her sister returned to Krakow as well. When Mrs. Verdeber realized that she would not be able to protect her daughters while she was forced to work for the Nazis in Plaszow, the local concentration camp, she arranged for them to be sheltered by a relative of her former housemaid. The older daughter, Rachel, was not yet 12 years old. The younger daughter was 3. Rachel's dress had covered buttons. Inside each button was a small diamond. Mrs. Verdeber instructed Rachel to use these diamonds in case of emergency. It was clear to Rachel that she was responsible for her little sister. The girls were at the mercy of the maid and the men in her family. As Nechama Tech pointed out, when young women or girls were hidden by non-Jews, sometimes a girl would become, quote, the de facto maid, not allowed to talk to anyone, go out, or open the door. Sexual predators, quote, exploited the girl within the unequal power dynamics of host and hider, end of quote. Rachel was helpless to object to exploitation and abuse by the maid and her family, while the younger child, Lynn, was treated as a pet. Rachel protected herself, her sister, by her acquiescence and silence. Forced to draw on her inner resources while in hiding, Rachel was no longer the little girl her mother had left behind during the ghetto period. After the war, when they were reunited, the mother-daughter relationship changed and reflected Rachel's emotional maturation. The experience of hiding and separation of parent and child, each having coped with their own traumas, changed their post-war relationships. The Stein brothers reversed roles with their parents, protecting them during the Holocaust and making decisions for the family afterwards. Rachel Verteber, too, had become self-sufficient. After they came to the United States, Mrs. Verteber had to cope with her own traumas and with supporting her daughters. She focused on feeding them physically, but couldn't feed their emotional needs. Rachel, now 17, once again had to depend on her own inner resources. In a new country, faced with the challenge of making a life for herself by herself, she learned a new language and navigated a new culture successfully. Mrs. Verteber's attempts to develop Lynn's Jewish identity fell flat. The child who had felt emotionally secure with her Polish Catholic protector was thrust into an alien environment in the United States. As a refugee child in public school, she wanted only to be just like the other American children. Hebrew school felt just as alien as the rest of America, and when she learned enough English to fit in, she didn't want to do anything like Hebrew school that would set her apart. With the passage of time, as Rachel and Lynn matured and had more insight into their mother's experiences, they grew to understand their differences and to appreciate the sacrifice that were made for them, but the fissures remained. Many Jews did not survive the challenges and grave dangers of hiding during the Holocaust. They made counterintuitive decisions to separate themselves from the Jewish community and rely on their own resources and the kindness of strangers, not knowing the consequences of their decision. The odds were against their survival in a hostile environment. Incentive for betraying Jews in hiding were great, and the physical challenges of sustaining life in cramped, unsanitary, and unsafe spaces were hard to overcome. When war ended and Jews came out of hiding, there was no normal to which to return. Normal had been interrupted and destroyed. They first had to negotiate their new reality, changes of place, language, economics, loss of community, emigration, and the need to integrate into a totally new environment. If the family had been separated, each person had to negotiate the impact of their separate experience, as well as the reality of living with family members who had also been changed by their experiences. Generational roles changed. Children often had to rely on their own resources, no longer subject to parental will. Still, the family exerted an emotional pull and moral authority. Jewish children who had been placed in the care of Christian families or institutions were sometimes identified after the war, either by Jews who came looking for them or by relatives who looked for them. Young children who survived in Christian environments often did not know that they were Jewish. Some remained Christians, learning their true identities only through so-called deathbed confessions by adoptive parents or relatives. Others remained conflicted about their identities. Margie N., who was protected by a wealthy countess in Italy, was browbeaten into consenting to baptism. That destroyed her sense of self. She was never quite sure of who she was, Catholic or Jewish. Going into hiding was a dangerous option, one usually taken by parents when other options were not feasible. The dangers of discovery and or betrayal were constant. People in hiding could not relax their vigilance for the briefest moment. Even after the war, Jews and their protectors were in danger from local collaborators and anti-Semites who would punish protectors for hiding Jews and administer their form of justice to the Jews who had been hidden. Given the long odds against the survival of Jews who went into hiding, each story of survival can be seen as miraculous. It is a wonder that any survived at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. I'd like to open it up to questions. So I'm going to take a look, see if we have any questions. Let's see. So how did Anne Frank, her diary, and her story gradually become the worldwide phenomenon that we know today?
I think that part of the reason was that it's so beautifully written, and it is such a wonderful document of adolescence under strained conditions. It's very approachable. It can be read by middle schoolers, and there is something in that story for everyone to identify with. But I want to caution you in that it is not a typical story of hiding. They had what one survivor who hid in the loft of a barn, she said when she saw the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, she said to herself, they had a toilet. This was the Waldorf Astoria compared to her experience of hiding. Because Otto Frank had the means and the time to prepare a hiding place that was reasonably comfortable, although there were many people in it, they had a relatively comfortable hiding experience. Of course, it didn't protect them from being betrayed, but most people had nowhere near the kind of comfort that the Frank family had.
Thank you. So I have another question. Can you recommend any good resources for those wanting to learn more about teaching about hiding during the Holocaust?
Liz?
Yeah, actually, thank you, Bonnie. I will tomorrow in her email, Molly will share a link to the museum's curriculum that will address that question. Thank you for asking. Bonnie, there's a question about numbers and how we know. How were there many people who passed as Christians during the Holocaust, and how do we know those kinds of figures?
I don't think we know figures. I don't think we will ever know a total of how many people went into hiding, how many people survived in hiding, because so many were betrayed either by others or by their own mistakes, which were usually inadvertent. So we just do not know. It's unfortunate. Some people find out when their protector or adoptive parent is at the end of their life and they feel they need to let the person know that they were born Jewish. There's a wonderful film called Ida, I-D-A, about that experience, which is very difficult for everyone involved, but we just will never know.
Thank you.
You're talking about, should we move
Sure.
on to the next question?
Sure.
Yeah. We're talking about what's called Stolpersteine in German. They're called tripping stones. They're metal plaques, bronze plaques set into the pavement. They're the size of a European cobblestone, but they are a little bit raised. The plaque is inscribed with the names of people who lived in that house. These Stolpersteine are inserted into the pavement right in front of the doorstep of the house. And they are not only in Germany, but I saw them in Italy, and I believe they're also in the Netherlands. And the stone is inscribed saying, these people lived in this house from until they were deported in whatever year, and they did not survive. So it's a kind of a memorial stone, sort of a gravestone for people who do not have one. It's very touching, and it keeps the memory of real people alive.
Thank you, Bonnie. Let's see if there's any more questions coming in. Again, you guys, if you have questions, can put them in the chat.
Bonnie, we're about to hear survivor testimony. And I'm wondering, and the survivor, Ms. Toby Levy, was in hiding for part of the time. Is it often the case that a person or a family was in hiding for part of the time of their Holocaust survival?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I'll use the family of Harry Stein as an example. They started out in a summer resort in an unused, in a bungalow that was closed up because the inhabitants of the bungalow went back to the city. It was a resort town on the in France, on the Mediterranean. Not the fancy part, but in Béziers, which is just a little town. So Harry, who belonged to a Zionist youth group that turned itself into a resistance group, he was told, he made friends with people in Béziers and had a girlfriend, and the girlfriend said, certain house is not occupied. You can break in and hide in that house. So for a while, the Stein family, parents and two sons, were hiding in that house. Harry was going in and out to his Zionist resistance group. The younger son, who was 13, was going in and out to do shopping for the family. The parents could not learn French properly. The mother knew a little bit of French, but it was with a heavy German accent because they were from Austria. And the false ID that Harry made for her was for a woman who lived in Alsace on the border of Germany and France. And so it would make sense that she spoke French with a German accent, but generally the parents stayed home. After a certain length of time, that was no longer feasible. The house was not heated. The neighbors were getting suspicious, so they had to move. And so I have to skip a piece of the story. They actually got on a train and they went to Grenoble, which is a city in the northeast of France, where they will live. First, they went to Nice, where there were a lot of Jewish refugees, and they lived openly as Jewish refugees. Then that became impossible because the Italians who protected the Jews pulled out, and then they moved to Grenoble, and then they went into hiding again. So it's in and out, and that is not untypical of many hiding experiences. In the Netherlands, where there was a big effort to hide children, some children were moved from hiding place to hiding place more than a dozen times. Imagine the trauma for those children.
And how did I mean, for children who were moved so frequently, was it possible later for families to be reunited?
Some families were reunited. It really depends on which country we're talking about. Um, in Belgium, where some adults were hidden, particularly women, they often found their children again, and there was it was possible to trace where the child was hidden through the resistance, through the Belgian resistance organizations. So if they found the child, they were reunited. Some Jewish survivors after the war took it upon themselves to look for Jewish hidden children. They looked in convents and monasteries. One man told us that he would ask at the convent or the monastery, are there any Jewish children here? Sometimes the nuns or the priests would say yes, and here they are. So they would be taken by a Jewish organization and mentored and placed in Jewish children's homes. Sometimes the church official would say, no, there were no Jewish children here. So this man who went looking for Jewish children would say, well, I have candy for all the children. So call the children to the courtyard. So the children would come to the courtyard looking for the candy, and he would say, Shema Yisrael, which is what children say, what people say before they go to sleep. And one of the prayers it's the first prayer that children learn as soon as they can talk. And the Shema Yisrael awakened that response in the Jewish children, and they came to the man with the candy and the Shema Yisrael. And that's how he was able to identify Jewish children. But many Jewish children were never identified. There was a bishop in France who had originally been a Jewish child who remained Catholic, and many others remained Catholic. And Margie N., who I mentioned, was never comfortable in either religion. She would go to a church and just sit there and think and relax. And she would go to a synagogue service hoping that it would feel right. And it sort of did, but never really. It's a very sad part of the story. But some Jewish children were identified. Many were taken to Palestine and then Israel. And some were actually adopted by American couples who were looking for a Jewish child to adopt.
Thank you. Molly, do we have any more questions, or is that it for today?
Yeah, I think, well, this is kind of a broad question, but we have a question from a teacher who teaches US history. And he's asking if there's something that you think that he should make sure to explain or convey that is often left out of the Holocaust history or out of the discussion or conversation. So again, it's a pretty broad question, but maybe you can focus it around hiding and passing, something that's left out of the conversation.
I think it's important to stress that we'll never know that full story. And it seems like an easy out, but it was very, very difficult and very dangerous. I made a point of saying that Sophie Billies and her husband, Henrik, were familiar with a non-Jewish environment. And that was very key to surviving in a non-Jewish environment. If you were hiding in a rural area and you had to know how to cross yourself, when to cross yourself, how to respond when it was a saint's day? What was your saint according to your false ID? You had to assume a lot of details that as a Jewish person, you would never have reason to know unless you sought out that information and memorized it. And it was a huge effort, and you couldn't relax for 1 minute because that could be your death sentence. So people don't appreciate how terribly dangerous every option was.
Thank you, Bonnie. So I think that is all the questions we have for you today. So thank you so much for your excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone for participating in this session. So we will have our last session coming up at 2 p.m. That is going to be a testimony by Toby Levy, who is a Holocaust survivor. And I put the registration for that session in the link at the top if you haven't registered but would like to join that final session. So you can register there. And again, just so you know, you need to register in order to join us. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you for our last session at 2.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you all for good questions.